Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Rabbi.
We are learning Mishna Nedarim, Parak Test, Chapter 9, Mishnah Zayin, Mishnah 7. Now, previous Mishnah said that a neder, shehutar miktsas shehutar kulei. If you have a neder and part of it has become permitted, meaning part of it was annulled, the whole thing becomes annulled. So now the Mishnah continues, Ketzad. How is this? Meaning, how do we apply this rule? Omar, if a person said, Kaina misha'eni nehena l'kolchem. Konam, meaning as a carbon, I will not have benefit from all of you. It's a group of people, and he says that he's making a neder that he's not going to have hana from all of them. That's his neder. Chutar echad mehen. Once one of them becomes permitted, meaning if one of them gets, if one of them becomes hutar, meaning he finds a reason to be able to annul the vow regarding one of them, hutru kulan, they all become permitted. Now, what's the case here? What is the case here of he went over to this group, he said to them, I made a neder not to benefit from all of them, and now one of them became permitted. How did that one become permitted? What's the basis for that? So here's the example. This is important to know regarding this part of the Mishnah. And that is, for example, they bring this down here in the notes. He discovered that his father was a member of the group. Mm-hmm. He went over to the group. He says, this whole group, I'm not having enough from. And then he sees, there's dad. Okay. Now, and he then indicated that he had not meant for his father to be included in the neder. That was an obvious mistake. Right? If his father was there, if he would have realized his father was there, and his father was there, he never would have made the neder. So it was an obvious mistake. In this case, the neder is automatically void with regard to his father, because the father's inclusion was a mistake. You don't need to go to a chacham for this one. You don't need a chacham for this one. This is not like a Pesach where, he did it. There was an issue that came up later that we say to him, if you would have thought about this, would you still made the neder? Here the point is, he made a neder, his father was there, and it was an obvious mistake regarding his father. Therefore, so says the Mishnah, if we discover that the neder was permitted for one, the neder doesn't apply to one, then guess what? It doesn't apply to all of them, because when he made the neder, he made the neder in a way where he said, all of you are usher. The rule that a partially annulled neder is completely annulled applies both to a neder that was partially annulled by a sage, by a Pesach, as we just said before, and to a neder that was partially annulled automatically, as in our case. Now, yesterday's case it was annulled through a Pesach, through a sage. Well, if part of it becomes annulled, then the rest of it is annulled. And in our Mishnah, the case is where there was no annulment that was needed. Basically, we know one part of the neder was an obvious mistake. Well, if one part of the neder is a mistake, the rest of it becomes, so to speak, a mistake also, and everything becomes permitted. Okay, that's the first case. Now, in the next case, he says, She'eni nene lozeh velozeh. I am not having benefit from this one and from this one. Now, the Bartanur explains that there is a little bit more to this case than what the Mishnah says. He mentioned each member of the group separately, and he said the second person is forbidden like the first person, and the third is forbidden like the second, etc., etc., etc. Okay, meaning there was a group of people there. He says, Ruvain, it's forbidden for me. It's forbidden for me to have benefit from you. Shimon, you're like Ruvain. Levi, you're like Shimon. Yehuda, you're like Levi. That's how he made this neder. Okay? So what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, Hutar harishain hutru kulan. If the first one, meaning Reuven said to Shimon, right? The first one that he made forbidden becomes permitted. How did it become permitted? Because they went to a chacham who found a Pesach, found an opening, and took off the neder regarding Shimon, the first one, hutru kulan. All of them now automatically become permitted. Now, this is not an example of one neder that part of it became permitted, so the rest of it becomes permitted. Because in essence, by saying, Shimon and Levi like Shimon, and Yehuda like Levi, these are separate vows. These are separate Nedarim. However, nonetheless, the Mishnah says that if the first one becomes permitted, they all become permitted. Why? Because the halacha is that when a chacham, when a sage annuls a vow, it's considered retroactively gone. It's retroactively annulled. Well, if it's retroactively annulled, that means that Shimon didn't have a neder. And Ruvain said Levi like Shimon, but Shimon doesn't have a neder. So then Levi doesn't have a neder. Because Levi's whole neder was made, the neder on Levi was regarding Levi was made that he should be like Shimon. But if retroactively Shimon never had a neder, then neither does Levi. Okay? And then the domino effect of all the rest of them, because all the rest of them are dependent on the one before. So therefore, the Mishnah says, Hutter Harishan, Hutter Kulan. The first one becomes permitted, they all become permitted. Hutter Ha'achrein, let's say the last one became permitted. The last one on the line became permitted. Ha'achrein Mutter, the last one is permitted. The Kulan Asurib, the rest of them are forbidden. The ones before him aren't dependent on him. He's dependent on the one before him. But the ones that are before him aren't, the ones before the last one aren't dependent on the last one. And therefore, if the last one becomes permitted, he's permitted, the rest of them are usher. Hutter Emtsai, let's say the middle one became permitted. Then we say, Hemenu Lamata Mutter, from him and down is permitted. Hemenu Lamala, usher, from him and above is usher. Because again, if let's say you have Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, right? So the point is that each one is dependent on the one before. So if, let's say, the middle one, let's say we just say Levi becomes permitted, okay? So that's going to permit Yehuda and Yisachar, because they all were, their neder was made that they should be like the one before. Okay, so once the one before becomes permitted, the rest of them fall. But the one before him had nothing to, his neder wasn't made to be like the one after him. And therefore, when it's the middle one that becomes permitted, from the middle and down becomes permitted, and up remain usher. Okay, now, next case. She'eni nehena lazeh carbon v'lazeh carbon. A person said, I will not have benefit for this one, from this person, carbon. For that one, carbon. Meaning, Reuven goes over to Shimon and he says, you, Shimon, are a carbon. And then he goes over to Levi and he says, you, Levi, carbon. Or he says, Reuven, Shimon, carbon. Levi, carbon. Says the Mishnah, each one needs their own opening. Each one needs their own annulment. Each one is essentially a separate neder. Now, what's interesting to note is that in the beginning of the Mishnah, we had a case where he said, She'eni nehena lazeh v'lazeh. Remember that one? When you say She'eni nehena lazeh v'lazeh, then the halacha was that again, there too, the halacha is that it was now essentially it's like this. Just give me 1 second. Right. Essentially, in the Mishnah before, when he said, lazeh v'lazeh, the halacha is the first one goes, the rest of them fall, right? So we said that the case there was that he said, Reuben said to Shimon, you're forbidden, and Levi, you're like Shimon, and Yehuda, you're like Shimon, right? That's what he said, okay? And we said that they're all dependent on each other. In this case, things are a little bit different, because in this case, what happened is, since he said a carbon regarding each person separately, he indicates that each is bound by a separate neder, and a separate neder requires its own annulment. Meaning, I think we need to make some clarification here. We had the case before when he said lazeh v'lazeh, that what he meant to say was that, you're basically, you're usher, and you're like him, and you're like him, you're like him. Let's say you didn't say you're like him, you're like him, you're like him. What you said was that you said, Eini nene, lazeh, v'lazeh, v'lazeh, v'lazeh. Didn't say anything. You didn't say you like him, you like him. You just said you, and you, and you, and you. What would have been the halacha there? The halacha there would have been the same thing as when you say to all of them, to all of you. It's one big neder. Konam for you, for you, for you, for you. It would have been one big neder. In our case in the Mishnah, though, what did he do? He said, carbon for you, carbon you, carbon you, carbon you. By adding the word carbon by each one, that means he was making a separate neder for each one. Meaning he's saying, you're a carbon, and you're a carbon, and you're a carbon, meaning like a carbon, forbidden like a carbon. By doing that, he indicates that each is bound by a separate neder, and a separate neder requires its own annulment. That's why the Mishnah says, in this last case, it needs a Pesach for each one. So if you say kulchem, or the same thing would be if you were to say carbon, carbon to you, to you, to you, to you, that would have been one. But at the end of the day, in this case of the Mishnah, last case of the Mishnah, because you added the word carbon by each one, that means, that indicates you're making a separate neder for each one, and therefore each one needs its own Pesach. Okay, before we conclude, just want to let everyone know, just remind everyone again, that we are in the middle of our annual fundraiser. So from now until tonight at midnight, all donations will be tripled at charity.com/BIM. Please click the link in the video description below to donate. Titzkel Mitzvahs. Thank you very much for listening. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Okay, we have a crowd of people, and